Now it's important to note everything I've done here so far is using the first-person character controller that comes with Unity standard assets. Now I'm mentioning this because if we read the Unity scripting reference, there is an important note here. Note that trigger events are only sent if one of the colliders also has a rigid body attached. But hang on, let's have a look here. We have our trigger volume. That doesn't have any rigid bodies. We have our first-person character controller. That doesn't have any rigid bodies anywhere as well, especially on that main object with the collider that enacted that. So what's going on there? Well, I can't explain it exactly. The first-person character controller is an exception. I could make a guess that somewhere in this character controller component it is taking care of the rigid body aspect needed for a trigger volume to be enacted if it has a rigid body attached. So that's the exception to the rule. If you're using a character controller, you don't have to worry about having a rigid body on any of these, as we've seen perfectly in our example. Okay, so what if we're not using the character controller component? Okay, what if we're using something else and we want to set off trigger events? Well, let's set up a scene for that. Just say this one as there's without no first-person character controller. Terrible naming convention, but there we go. Okay, so let's fix this scene up. Let's get rid of the first-person controller. Now we need a camera again. So there it is. Okay, so let's just make this our main camera. And just for convention's sake, I'll also tag it. So I'll save this scene. So now we have a scene without a character controller. So what are we going to use to roll into that trigger zone? Well, let's roll in a sphere. So there's a sphere. Now I need to create a script just quickly to move this sphere around for our tests. So scripts, create JavaScript, this will be our sphere script. Okay, I'm just going to do some basic transform movement for this. So let's just add in transform dot position. We're going to add to it the transform forward of the object times some kind of speed variable, and then of course we want to do that every update, so we need to decrease that by time dot delta time. So there's just our movement for our sphere for this example. We'll attach that script to the sphere. Now the trigger volume hasn't changed. We still have the trigger volume script, and on that we have the 3 events here. So it should tell us the collider that came into the other collider that came into this trigger and give us our debugs. Now let's see what happens. So the sphere is moving forward. Okay, it's gone right through that trigger volume now, and we've had no debugs. So what's happened there? Well, exactly as the Unity scripting references stated to us. Note that trigger events are only sent if one of the colliders also has a rigid body attached. So let's see if we can quickly modify this sphere object, component, physics, rigid body. So I've now given that sphere a rigid body. Now let's see our console what happens. Okay, well the sphere's fallen over, so let's freeze the constraints there. Okay, let's freeze its rotation so it doesn't roll over like that. Let's try again. Okay, so there we have it. Just as described in the Unity scripting reference, we needed to have a rigid body component attached to that sphere. With the rigid body, we have an option here to set it to is kinematic. Let's try it with that option on. Okay, so you see as we set it to is kinematic, what this has done is it's made it impervious to all other forces. So it hasn't rolled over under its own velocity or anything like that. It's kinematic. It's basically frozen itself there as well. And as you see, as we run it, we get the normal entered, and we would have a stay there and the exit. I could even uncomment that stay again, just so that you can see that working. All the way at the top, and we entered, and then for all that time while it was traveling through it, we had the stay, and then we left the trigger volume and we had the exit. So that's how you set up objects that don't have a character controller component. If you want to use a trigger volume with any other type of object, you must have a rigid body attached. And as I just demonstrated, for trigger volumes, it doesn't matter if it's kinematic or it's not kinematic. So again, we'll just freeze the rotations. So actually, now that we have a rigid body, let's even modify the sphere script. Working with rigid bodies, we can go on a fixed update, and let's get rid of all this, and let's just say our rigid body dot velocity equals the transform forward times that speed multiplier. Freeze constraints, kinematics off. Now same thing, but I'm just setting the velocity of the rigid body. And there, everything's still happening exactly as it should. Entered, we've stayed, and we've exited. Okay, and then one more time, just maybe again using the is kinematic and modifying the velocity. Actor must be non-kinematic to set the velocity. Well, that makes perfect sense. So I'm going to leave it there. Save that scene.